nerdy,
nostalgic.
Madly inappropriate.
This
is Nerd Hat.
Nerd Hat, I'm with late. Why am I robot?
Nerd Hatters, I am here with a special guest, Will Thwaites, who is a writer, director, producer, editor, and probably were you the other things too, like gaffer and like all of that for this film, pretty much everything?
Yeah, accountant, line producer, archival producer, production assistant. Yeah, catering, crafty. It was all me.
So he's the almost one-man show for Crime and Parody, which is a documentary film that's playing today and also next Friday. We're recording this on a Saturday, so it's playing about 2 hours from now, roughly. And then again next Friday, which will be after this episode's releases. So if you're in town in Winston-Salem, go check it out. I believe it's playing at the Marketplace Cinema around, I think, 5 o'clock next Friday, and in person only. So make sure you catch this one before the festival ends. So Will, thank you for reaching out and talking about a interview and coming on the Nerd Hat podcast. We're really glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be chatting.
So we usually do a little bit of background with our guests, and a question I like to ask is, was there a movie or a film that really grabbed you when you were younger, at whatever point at which this journey began for you, and you said, wow, I want to be involved in that. I want to write, direct, make movies? Like, was there something that really inspired you, or was it more of a gradual process for you?
Yeah, it was a really gradual process for me. Like, I'm not a film nerd. It's not like I was going to art house cinemas in high school watching Wong Kar-wai films or French cinema. I was watching the Goonies and Jurassic Park when I was a kid and not thinking about them as if they were high art or anything like that. But then slowly over time, I started to get more and more interested in storytelling broadly. And I feel like the big thing for me was actually This American Life. It was the podcast, the radio show, This American Life, that really drew me to the kind of storytelling that I'm now doing professionally. And it's just like real stories about real people, not famous people, unlikely characters from unlikely places that are going through some sort of amazing transformation or journey or heartbreak or something like that. So in a lot of ways, it was being a 22-year-old at a kind of crappy day job, listening to This American Life, learning about the mechanics of what it takes to tell a story that's high stakes and emotional and dramatic and things like that.
I'm trying to recall, is that an NPR podcast or is it
PRX? Yeah, it's hosted. Yeah, it's well, you know what? It's confusing these days. I mean, like, I think of it in the NPR umbrella, but who knows how the mechanics of public radio actually works. It might be independently distributed. I think the way that Ira Glass, the host, talks about it is that public radio is radically decentralized. And so who knows who the heck's putting out what. But yeah, I think when people think about NPR, they think about people talking in really stilted voices, and then This American Life and Ira Glass, which is the opposite of that.
And it's been a minute since I've listened to an episode, but I'm familiar with that as well, and that is a good podcast, so I would recommend it also. So that and that type of storytelling really grabbed you. Where did you get your start? Did you start out in audio or radio podcasting, or did you start in film, kind of more documentary style? Like,
yeah, I started in film, and I went to, you'd call it film school. I went to Notre Dame in Indiana and studied in their film program. And at the time, like most, I don't know, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, I didn't really know what I was doing. I just knew that it was more fun than engineering or accounting. And so it was cool to point a camera at interesting things. But at the time, I didn't know what the hell a story was. We're all delusional about kind of knowing the mechanics of these things. But you can fake it, and like your college professors don't really care because they're hammering a check regardless of how good your movies are. So yeah, I mean, I had like film roots long before I ever figured out really how to tell a story. And then in my 20s, I feel like it was the collision of two things for me. It was that I started working at a documentary production company called Cartemquin Films. They're famous for a movie, Hoop Dreams, that came out back in the 90s, one of the sort of like seminal documentaries of the past 70 or 100 years. And I was an intern there, and then an outreach coordinator and an associate producer, and spent my formative years working at Cartemquin. And their real ethos is telling like hard-hitting social issue documentaries. They're at any given moment tackling the most urgent subjects you could imagine around like race and inequality and like small people fighting against powerful people. And they've made some 50 odd amazing films. everything from Minding the Gap to Vietnam, Long Road Coming, and The Interrupters and Life Itself. So some of the most amazing documentaries of the past 50 years came out of Cartemquin, and that's kind of where I got my start. But then my career is interesting in the sense that I start out making these hard-hitting social issue documentaries, and then to try to make a living off of this, I quickly shift towards television. So I started working on Netflix shows and Hulu shows and shows with Anthony Bourdain and shows with Norman Reedus from The Walking Dead, and my next guest with David Letterman and Full Swing on Netflix, a show about professional golfers. And those projects are much more commercial. But also what they have is they've got like storytelling down in a way that your average viewer really enjoys it. Like those projects are very story driven. You might turn on a Cartemquin movie, and if you're not in the right mood for it, turn it off in 30 minutes because like it's just a little bit too slow for you. But if you flip on Netflix and you're watching Full Swing about Rory McIlroy winning the Masters, like that's the sort of storytelling that really keeps the average person engaged. And so in some ways, I think my creative identity is the collision of those two worlds, kind of Cartemquin films, making movies that are really about the mission and the issues at the heart of them, and trying to combine that with some of the more entertainment-driven work that I've done, making shows for Netflix and Hulu and Amazon and History Channel.
So I was just looking at your IMDb, seeing you've had quite a few different roles over the years. Do you have one that was maybe your favorite? Like, is being now writer, director, and handling the whole thing yourself, is that like the ultimate of this was, I don't know if goal is the right word, but you were hoping to work towards that? Or
So on this movie, my new movie that just came out, Crime and Parody, I play a lot of different roles, like we talked about at the very beginning. I shot the whole film myself. I directed the movie myself. I produced the movie myself. I co-edited the movie myself. It's not to say that there weren't a bunch of other amazing people that supported the project. The co-editor, Jeff O'Brien, that worked on the movie, and consulting producers Diane Kwan and Naila Sims and Liz Hodes and Olivia Snyder-Spock, and co-producer Lumiere Rostick. So many amazing people made this film possible. But I really like making independent projects like this. And because money is tight when it comes to independent projects, you sort of have to do it all yourself, or you got to wait around until someone gives you a huge chunk of cash. And that never really happened for me on this project. So yeah, I like doing a little bit of everything. But if your question was like, what's a project from my past that was really seminal or like shaped who I am? Weirdly enough, I've worked on stuff that won Emmy Awards, and I've worked on stuff that was again on Netflix and Hulu. But weirdly, the most informative show in my past is a show that I made for Animal Planet called The Zoo. And it was this really interesting series where for 7 months at a time, me and a crew of, I don't know, 5, 10 people would go up to the Bronx Zoo every day for 10 hours a day and just film behind the scenes with zookeepers. And we would be telling stories about red pandas that were giving birth, and tigers that needed a root canal, and camels that were struggling with their teeth. And what was really cool about that project is because it was like an embedded behind the scenes, what you'd call verte project that was just kind of following people around in their daily lives, it just gave me a bunch of reps at like making movies essentially. Because every day you just woke up at 6 a.m., you got to the zoo by 7 a.m., you filmed for 10 hours, you tried your best to try to make a story out of that pink flamingo that had a broken leg, and then you'd go home at the end of the day. And so in a lot of ways, my creative fabric was shaped mostly by this weird little Animal Planet show called The Zoo.
nice. I could see the appeal of that. Like you really get to dive in and connect with your subject in a way that, I mean, you just sit down for a couple hours of an interview or maybe a day of an interview, you wouldn't get that same level. I noticed, and listeners, I was able to preview Crime and Parody. Sadly, I've not made it through the whole thing yet, but I will. I will finish it. But I got about halfway through, and I noticed that you were there during, or at least it seemed, unless someone else recorded that footage, but it seemed like you were there during some of the legal proceedings. So you had entered in at that point where they were going through some of this. You got to walk through some of that with the Novak family. I don't want to do any spoilers. I mean, I know it's a doc film, so it's real life, but what was that experience like of working behind the scenes with the Novak family? And maybe along with that, how did you come to know them? and their story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't I give the log line of the movie just so people have a little bit of context for the film? It's basically Crime and Perry is a feature-length documentary about an amateur comedian from Parma, Ohio, that made a fake Facebook page making fun of his local police department. It looked like their real page, but all the posts, they were totally absurd. He makes 6 jokes online. It's relatively harmless, and a SWAT team ends up kicking in his front door with guns drawn. They throw him in county jail for 4 days, and they put him on trial for a felony that carries a maximum sentence of up to 18 months in prison. And so it's really like a small story that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's a story about free speech and satire and constitutional rights and things like that. Now, the cheat that I had is that this movie takes place in my hometown. So I grew up in Parma, Ohio, where the story mostly unfolds. And so I like to say that I grew up 1.8 miles from Anthony Novak, the main character in this film. And that made it really easy to go back and say, hey, Anthony, would you mind if I followed you around with a camera for a handful of days to make this documentary about you? I feel like if I was some snooty New Yorker, that might have been more challenging in Parma, Ohio. But because I had that sort of regional buy-in, it was much easier to make this film. And getting to know Anthony and his family was amazing. Like, I think it comes through in the movie. They're just real salt of the earth people, really normal folks, the way that I would have talked about in admiring This American Life. Like, Anthony is not an extraordinary person by conventional metrics. Like, he is not a famous comedian. He does not have a huge following online. It's not like he makes money off of making fake Facebook pages, making fun of the local police department. It's just like he's a normal guy that has sort of a normal desk job. And in his spare time, he likes to make jokes online. And there's something really interesting about stories where a not so extraordinary person ends up in extraordinary circumstances. And it was really fun to get to spend time with Anthony and get to experience what that was like for him. And I don't say that he's not an extraordinary guy and that I don't think
Yeah,
Anthony's
yeah.
amazing. It's just that he's not Kim Kardashian. He is not Lionel Messi. He is Anthony Novak from Parma, Ohio, who made 6 jokes and ended up facing 18 months in prison for that.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of, in terms of the film industry, I'd liken to that maybe in some ways to when you have these big films, sometimes they deliberately cast relative unknowns because they want the focus to be on the character and the story, not on, oh, shoot, Brad Pitt is playing Aragorn in Lord of the Rings or something.
Yeah.
So I think that does seem to me provide a nice entry point for just regular folks who are like, oh, well, shoot, I've done something similar to that. I posted something like
That
that.
is,
What if
yeah,
I got
that is
arrested?
that is a funny reaction that, like, now that the film is starting to roll out, it's played at a handful of film festivals. It premiered at Big Sky in Montana, played at ATL Doc in Atlanta, where we won the Best Director Award, which was cool. And one of the
Nice.
things that's been interesting is that, like, a lot of younger people in particular's reaction is like, man, I got to check my Facebook to make sure that I didn't do anything that could get me in trouble like this, which I think is what makes Anthony's story is so relatable. The jokes that he was making on this page, in the grand scheme of things, are nothing burgers. Like, they are not inflammatory. They are like silly satire and like a little bit of no harm, no foul in a lot of ways. But the police in Parma took it as a harm, and they tried to flag it as a fairly significant foul. And the movie kind of plays out watching Anthony experience what it's like to legitimately have a jury trial in front of 9 or 12 of his peers deciding, will he go to jail for 18 months or not over these 6 jokes on Facebook.
Now, how did you first hear about his story? I assume you don't live in Parma anymore, but do you still keep in touch with the news around there? Did you have someone local who's like, hey, did you hear about this? Or
Yeah. I mean, I would love to tell you that I'm a good enough researcher and a tuned in enough journalist / documentary filmmaker that I've got my finger on the pulse, not only of Parma, but everywhere in the world. But the truth is, like, a lot of times you hear about these stories sort of randomly. And in this case, it was a friend from college who texted me that was just like, hey, isn't this kind of crazy story about your hometown? And it had a link to an article that said something like, Ohio cops think this guy should go to jail for making fun of them. And sure enough, like, I click on that article and here it is, Parma, Ohio, where I grew up. And this kind of extraordinary case was playing out there. So yeah, I didn't have my finger on the pulse well enough with Parma politics and contemporary topics that I picked this one out myself. But I'm lucky enough to have good friends that text me when interesting things are happening, and lucky enough to have the know-how about how to make a documentary when they are.
Obviously, I can think of some ways that this is very relevant this year. I mean, I know this topic of qualified immunity has obviously come up in the news a decent amount this past year. But when you started the process, was there anything specific that kind of gave an outside impetus to like, wow, I really want to make this and put this story out because it's important for this time and place? And was there anything, if you want to mention?
Yeah. I mean, what's so funny about making a movie and any story really is that you have to be so confident, almost overly confident when you're starting the project, that like you have to be a little bit delusional about whether or not people will actually watch this thing or care about this thing. And so I'll be honest, at the start of the project, I was probably a little bit delusional, and I knew all the right things to say about why this movie mattered. I mean, I started filming it initially in 2022, actually. At the time, like the things I would have said are like free speech really matters, and we really need to hold our government accountable, and we need to make sure that comedy doesn't come under attack. But in 2022, this is like a little bit post-COVID. Do we really care about those things? Like, obviously, free speech is always a thing that in America is top of mind, but I wouldn't say it was the most urgent issue that any of us were thinking about at the time. And while it's always important to hold our government accountable, I don't necessarily think there were things happening at the time that made that thing feel like it was the highest stakes topic to think about. And so the kind of wild thing about how these projects work out is you're delusional at the beginning, but by the end, you realize like, wait, this is really important. I mean, this movie came out in 2026, 6 months after Jimmy Kimmel was kicked off the air, essentially because he got in a tussle with the FCC and the Trump administration. And like, we were literally watching comedy come under attack from the federal government right as this movie was about to come out. And Stephen Colbert was ostensibly kicked off of the air because of his political satire and some of his political beliefs. And at the same time, government accountability, which is at the heart of this film, like the things that we watched play out in Minneapolis and Washington, D.C. and Chicago when it came to like literally armed personnel on behalf of the government coming into communities and not only just like causing huge disruption, but literally killing people and then not being held accountable for those crimes. Government accountability is now very much top of mind for people. And so some of that delusionalness or some of that storytelling that you do in your own head at the beginning of the process usually pays off, because by the end, some of those things that were theoretical to you about like, I think comedy is important, I think free speech is important, I think we should hold the government accountable, by the time your project is done, usually those hypotheses, as you might call them, are really playing out in real time.
Getting more behind the scenes a little bit, and given that, as we talked a little bit about before we're getting on, I've been trying to kind of move into getting into podcasting as a business myself. Been trying to think about the legal sides of that. And I know with doing a doc, especially one that covers an issue where you're bring actual court cases and things like that. Did you have to get some extra legal help, like purchase extra insurance, things like that on the backside, just to protect yourself in the case of any lawsuits from?
Yeah.
Or
I will tell you, it's like a little bit of inside baseball for making a movie. You do a bunch of things throughout the process that are like a little bit touch and go, and you're like pulling in clips from YouTube and hoping you can figure out a way to use them. And so usually it's like a 3-year process where you're not positive if and what of the movie can actually come out. And the most amazing moment is right at the end of the project when you get insurance. And basically a lawyer and an insurance company says like, everything that's in the movie you have permission to do. And so
nice.
that happened to me back in February, right before the film had its world premiere, where the insurance policy came into place. And I don't say that because I'm an insurance nerd, but I say that because there's nothing quite as satisfying as making a 90-minute movie with, I think, 8,000 different clips of video and audio in it, and knowing that you essentially have permission to use every one of those 8,000 different pieces of media in your project. And your estimation was right in the sense that I did have to be pretty careful with a movie like this in a number of ways. It covers a court case, it covers legal proceedings. Like, Anthony went to trial for this case. He then sued the police for violating his First Amendment right to free speech. Like, over the course of that criminal trial and the civil lawsuit that followed, like, The police did some relatively dicey things depending on how you interpret them. There's a chance that they may have lied on the stand about the things that Anthony did that allowed them to get warrants to arrest him. They may or may not. They sort of allegedly misrepresented what Anthony did to a grand jury to ever get those warrants in the first place and to be able to indict Anthony. And so, because there are some sensitive legal topics there, you have to be careful. And so, I had kind of two different legal teams that worked on the project with me. One lawyer that was watching it with a keen eye for, like, can you say this? Are you allowed to say this? Are you allowed to show this? Are you making claims that are too inflammatory? Are claims that feel like they're pretty middle of the road and neutral? And that lawyer ultimately gives the project a thumbs up and helps like with that insurance policy. And then there's another team that does what's called a fair use letter. And basically what that legal team is doing is saying everything in the movie that has a copyright attached to it. So there's a Monty Python clip in the film and a Naked Gun clip in the film because it's about satire and parody. And there are some logos in the backgrounds of shot. Basically, that fair use legal team looks at it and says, within the doctrine of fair use, which allows you to use copyrighted material as long as you're transforming it, as long as you're making a commentary on it, as long as you're using a reasonable amount of it, as long as you're not competing with the original artwork. As long as you're checking sort of all those boxes and a few more, then you have permission to use these things. And so ultimately that legal team gives it their seal of approval too. And as I say, basically everything in the film is quote unquote allowed to be in the movie. And the one other thing that helps with a story like this is challenging with court cases that are open-ended is that it's all been litigated in court. Like no one says anything in the movie that I can't back up with trial transcripts that they said it under oath in front of a judge and a jury, or that didn't happen in official depositions with multiple lawyers present, asking the questions and getting to object if they don't feel comfortable in them. And so nothing that I'm saying in the movie, even though it covers legal cases, hasn't already been said in court by someone more important than me. And so that helps you feel a little bit more protected when you make a movie like this.
That makes sense. I imagine even like I saw some of the deposition clips and things like that. Uh, I don't know if those are things like that involved in, is that actually on public record with issues like that? Do you have to do, I assume you have to do like a
Yes.
record request or?
Through some combination of that fair use doctrine, as well as things being kind of public record, those clips are allowed to be in a movie like this. So, yeah, again, the fact that the trial and the lawsuit were over by the time that I really started filming this movie in earnest, it made it a little bit easier to not end up in dicey legal territory. Things would be a little trickier if litigation was ongoing and I was making claims about the police did X or Anthony did Y.
Now, and getting into more the technical side, because I know you mentioned as we were talking leading up to this that you like talking about the behind the scenes stuff too, and with the camera work. So you're doing the cinematography yourself, correct? And what I'm just curious, what type of camera or cameras do you like to use or did you use for this? And then mic setup as well. From what I could tell, you yourself as the questioner were not mic'd. Maybe you were being picked up with the mic that was directed at the subject. But is there anything with that you'd like to share? Because I like learning about that kind of stuff myself.
Yes. So the whole I would say 80% of the movie is shot on a Sony FX6, which is a great camera if you're trying to make run and gun documentaries. It's fancy enough that it looks pretty when you're watching it in a movie theater, but it's small and semi-reasonably priced enough that you can kind of buy one yourself if you've got a little bit of extra money and make a documentary like this one with. So most of the movie is shot on Sony FX. And then lenses wise, it's a combination of a Sigma zoom lens, like a 24-70 Sigma zoom lens, and then some vintage prime lenses. Canon FDs is kind of the colloquial term for them. And they're like old school photography lenses from the 70s and 80s that have like a nice vintage look to them. So some of the more cinematic B-roll in the film is shot on these Canon FDs. And then mics wise, all the interviews are primarily recorded on a Shep's microphone, which is like kind of an industry standard for audio people when you're doing documentary style interviews like this. So those are with the Shep's shotgun mic. And then the lavalier microphones that I use, the packs themselves are Zaxcom, which is kind of cool because Zaxcom not only transmits wirelessly like typical lavalier microphones or lav packs would, but it also records internally. And so what
Nice.
that means is as a one-man band that was running around making this movie by himself, I could put two different microphones on two different people. And even though you can't send both of those wireless signals back to your camera directly without kind of getting fancy about it, all the audio was being recorded directly to the lavs. And so that meant that I could essentially have two people mic'd without needing to record that to the camera. So yeah, that's like a little bit about some of the technical stuff that I did. And I would say that the overall ethos of my technical approach is a lot of the things that you hear me talk about there are to try to make this as small and nimble as possible. That like there are fancier cameras than the one I use. You could use an Alexa Mini or an Alexa 35 or even a Sony Venice 2, but those cameras are big and lunky, and you'd need like 9 different things even just to get a shotgun microphone patched into them. And so a lot of the choices that I'm making are about how to keep things small so that when you're in a car with Anthony and you just want to hear him talk a little bit about that experience of coming home from his criminal trial, it's really easy just to do that sitting in his passenger seat and filming with him. And you don't have to like stop and have your AC run over and blow with his little blower in the lens. And you don't have to have a separate audio person riding in a different car like 15 feet behind you. So a lot of my choices are about just like making sure it stays small and nimble so that the priority can be on getting the most emotional content out of the people that you're filming with and not worrying so much about like, is this camera the fanciest one that I could afford to use?
With the Sony FX, do you watch on a monitor? Do you have like a monitor mounted on a rigging with the
Yeah,
mic there as well?
I just use the normal like LCD, just like the normal
Okay.
display that comes stock with the Sony FX6. Here's my one dirty little secret that when I was a 24-year-old would have made me throw up, and as a 36-year-old makes me feel totally comfortable is I shoot a lot of my documentary content on autofocus, especially because I'm trying to do this stuff myself. Like it's nice to not worry so much about is this shot in focus and I
Mhm.
worry a little bit more about am I getting emotional moments out of these characters that I'm with. And so like again, I would have been embarrassed by that 10 years ago, and now I'm just like no one cares if you're like really dialing in your prime lenses. What they actually care about is do they feel something as Anthony's grappling with like the stakes of what it would have felt like to really go to jail for this thing. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's maybe my one little dirty secret. Autofocus on that Sigma zoom lens, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that.
I hear you. I know how technical and precise that can get. Like, and you got to have lighting just so to match your set. I mean, it just. So yeah, I hear you there. And I suppose that adds even a little character too. Like, say if it shifts focus at one point, it almost makes the shot a little interesting of shift in and out because I think, oh, the cameraman did that. It's like, nope.
Yeah,
But it
yeah.
makes it seem like that. Like maybe it was purposeful. I would imagine.
There's definitely some of that, but there's also this thing too, like I made this movie and I think the kind of projects I want to work on, I made this movie for the people. And my aunt and uncle are going to be at the screening tonight here at RiverRun
Oh, nice.
International Film Festival. They could care less if this movie was shot on primes, right? They're not going to notice if, oh, the bokeh, the bokeh of these lights was so amazing. They're going to care about much more basic things for a film like this. So I'm not going to stress about whether or not bit of an autofocus rack focus that doesn't look quite as cinematic
Mhm.
as if you had some amazing Cook primes with it doesn't matter. Emotion is the only thing that really matters. Character, story, obstacles, stakes, like some of this other stuff I think is a little bit superfluous. It isn't to say that you shouldn't try to make your movie look pretty. I hope
Yeah.
people resonate with some of the visuals of my film, but a lot of the visuals of my film are in service of the rest of the things that are happening as opposed to the focus.
How much did you try? Like, how much footage would you say you took total?
Man, tons, way too much to be honest. I mean, to put it in data terms, I think my hard drives that I edited this film on are a total of 26 terabytes. So you could picture that there's 26 terabytes that edited down to a now 87-minute movie. So what? That's basically a terabyte of footage for every 2 minutes of edited documentary, which is kind of insane. My guess is I probably shot like upwards of 200 to 300 hours of footage to make this movie. And I think that's pretty typical of documentaries. This isn't even really a Verte-driven documentary. There's not a ton of day in the life, like watching Anthony make his coffee in the morning. There's not of like going to Anthony's pickup basketball game. This is like kind of a past tense story, sort of in the spirit of something you might see on Netflix or Hulu, where it's sit down interviews and cinematic visuals to complement those things. And even still, you have to shoot 200 hours of that stuff just to end up making a 90-minute documentary. So yeah, a lot of footage that edited down to something hopefully that's pretty tight.
Now, getting into the editing room, I know you mentioned you co-edited this,
Yeah.
which given the amount of film, I mean, I can only imagine how long it would take doing all of it yourself. Like, what did that process look like? Did your co-editor, did they handle maybe some of the more, for lack of a better term, mundane side of that? Like, hey, let's cut out all the ums in this section. Let's cut out the or did you guys
It's
kind of go back and
kind of
forth
the
on that?
opposite in the way. I handled the boring stuff. He handled the fancy stuff.
Okay.
As you could imagine, with 26 terabytes of footage or 200 hours of footage that needs to end up in a 90-minute documentary, a lot of the early editing is just trying to get the story down, like trying to figure out what the hell you're doing. And that takes a really long time. I mean, documentaries that play at Sundance and South by Southwest, those movies, they'll edit for a year before they ever get ready to share their films. I was able to do it a little bit quicker than that. Like, I probably edited on the movie myself for maybe 25 weeks, half a year, 6 months by myself, just trying to whittle down like all these pieces into something that resembled like a 2-hour rough cut or assembly. And then the editor that I brought in, a guy named Jeff O'Brien, who's amazingly accomplished. He edited on the New York Times Presents for many years. He was the editor of a pretty notable project called Framing Britney Spears that was pretty buzzy back in, I want to say 2022 or 2023, about the Britney Spears conservatorship. Multi-Emmy award-winning editor. He came in for that last chunk of the edit to really take what was a slightly messy edit and turn it into a really sharp 90-minute movie. And so in some ways, I was doing a lot of the grunt work of like just trying to get the basics of the story down. And he did a lot of the fancy work of how do we make this stuff really sing.
No, and I, not being a professional editor by any means myself, but having done at least a bit of it for podcasting, just I was paying some attention to that and just the story structure and the editing structure. And I really liked it. I thought it flowed really well. And I think you personally, I mean, I think you accomplished what you intended to in terms of emotional attachment to the Novaks and to their story and just bringing you into that. And then I was just getting to the point before we had to start here where it was beginning to expand beyond that. And you started talking about the court cases in the past and the precedent with qualified immunity. And I was like, oh, this is getting broader. This is getting very relevant to this year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've always thought about the movie as a Trojan horse, that some of the silliness of a story about an amateur comedian kind of ending up in a pickle, a serious pickle, but like that the humor in that thing could bring you in and help you grapple with things that were much more high stakes. And so the film in some ways almost plays out in two parts. The first half or 2/3 of the movie is about this amateur comedian, Anthony Novak, but it just so happens that when he sues the police for violating his First Amendment right to free speech, and I think his Fourth Amendment right, basically that the
So search and
government
seizure.
had, like essentially it was I think the way his lawyer describes it, it was a malicious prosecution, that like authorities had come after him in a malicious way. So when he sues to try to have both of those things remedy, ultimately his lawsuit is thrown out because of this legal doctrine called qualified immunity. And qualified immunity, depending on how you see it, is basically a get out of jail free card for government officials that says you can't sue them for violating your rights unless there's an exact court case identical to your own case that has already been litigated that says they can't do a thing. So sort of in Anthony's case, I mean, this is a little bit oversimplifying it, but like because there wasn't another comedian thrown in jail for a Facebook page, Anthony was not able to sue the police for violating his First Amendment right to free speech. we're 37 minutes into this podcast now,
Mhm.
and we're only first talking about qualified immunity, and that really mirrors the film in a lot of ways. Had we started out this conversation talking about qualified immunity, two words that kind of make your eyes glaze over a little bit, and you start to tune out, you're like, what are we talking about? Legal doctrine, precedent, blah blah blah. You would have never stuck around to the 37th minute of my movie or this podcast if that's how things led off. But that Trojan horse element of bringing you into the story through a character, bringing you into a story through humor, in a lot of ways opens the door to be able to talk about much more substantial issues, qualified immunity being one of them. And as you'll see in the film when you continue watching, and as hopefully more people watch the movie, there's a second storyline in the film. It's about a character named Omar Arrington Bay. And Omar Arrington Bay grew up 15 miles from me and Anthony in another suburb of Cleveland called Shaker Heights, Ohio. And after having a mental health crisis, Omar was killed by police in jail. And those officers that killed him got off because of qualified immunity, the same thing that got officers off in Anthony's case. And so these two very disparate stories, one that's relatively low stakes in the grand scheme of things, a story about a comedian thrown in jail for a joke, and the highest stakes story you could ever imagine about a man murdered in jail by police, were united by this obscure legal doctrine, qualified immunity, that prevented both of their families, and in Anthony's case, Anthony himself, from getting justice for the way that government officials treated him. And so again, that gets back to this idea of Trojan horse, that who knows if minute one, if I started talking about some of those things, if people would have stuck around just because of how challenging some of those issues are, how dense some of those issues are, how heartbreaking some of those issues are, how uncomfortable some of those issues are. Like,
Very heavy.
sometimes you need a little bit of hand holding to get to the point emotionally where you can grapple with those things. And my hope is that the film can do that for you, that it can open the door to talk about much more serious issues. And to bring it all back to like my inspiration in a lot of ways, This American Life that I just love. I feel like I'm just doing an advertisement for them at this point in time. And if your audience has any podcast or radio savvy, they'll clearly have already known about This American Life, the most famous one out there. When Ira Glass talks about his storytelling, he always says that they're kind of making journalism that plays out almost like a musical. They're basically making Fiddler on the Roof every week on This American Life. And the way that a musical typically plays out is it's kind of funny at the beginning, then it takes a turn for the really serious, and by the end, it drives to sort of some big idea about the world, a reflection about who we are as human beings. And they're doing that every week on This American Life. And then the hope is with this movie that it does that same thing, that it can play out like Fiddler on the Roof or Wicked or Seussical the Musical, funny at the beginning and really serious by the end.
No, and I do think comedy is a good primer, which I guess is kind of at the heart of it too. I mean, satire is important and has been for, I guess, centuries, really, an important check on power. And yeah, that just seems very, even more so this year, it seems, as there's more challenges to that, at least from the top, than we've seen in some time, if not ever in some ways,
Yeah, yeah.
at least in American history, but without saying too much.
For sure. Well, I mean, to your point there. So one of the cool parts about this movie is that The Onion is in it. So the head writer
Yeah.
of The Onion, Mike Gillis, is one of the main participants in the film, and he's so great. I mean, he makes some of the best satire in the world every day. So you can imagine Mike Gillis is a very sharp man and a very funny person and a very big thinker about why these things matter. And there's two quotes from the film that stand out for me from Mike. At one point in time, he says, like, the Constitution enshrines this right to free speech, and what are you going to do with free speech if not mock the most powerful people in the country? And that really lands for me, that regardless of what side of the aisle you stand on, in some ways, we should all be making fun of government officials because it's one of the few tools that we have to hold them accountable and to sort of point out the hypocrisy. Speech more broadly and comedy very specifically is this tool to kind of like point out truths in the world, deeper truths, and point to them in a funny way. So that's one of the quotes I like from Mike about like, what are you going to do with free speech if not mock the most powerful people in this country? And then the second one that comes later in the film, it's sort of about why comedy matters. And Mike says, comedy makes the work of understanding the world around you not feel like work. And that's really the heart of this movie, that it feels like homework to go see a film about qualified immunity. You feel like you're in your 7th grade civics class, and man, is it a snooze fest. But watching an hour or an 87-minute documentary that starts off really funny, all of a sudden, comedy makes the work of understanding qualified immunity and free speech and government accountability not feel like work. It makes it feel like something that you're intrinsically motivated to do, is what Mike says. And so, yeah, I think comedy is really important. This seems hyperbolic, but we'll say it now more than ever.
Are there some ways in which going through this process, of making this film and living with it for so long, spending hundreds of hours, I'm sure, on the editing process, at the end of the day, are there ways in which this story has changed you as a person, challenged you to maybe change the way you move in the world, or just deepen things in your own life?
Yeah, I mean, there's one part of that that happens in the movie that I think is kind of powerful in terms of how I was shaped. So we've talked about it a little bit now, but this movie starts off as a story about a silly comedian from my hometown that looks a lot like me, that sounds a lot like me, that in a lot of ways could have been me, going through a crazy, but sort of like, I don't know, not that huge of a deal, right? Ultimately, well, I won't spoil it for you, but at the end of the day, in the grand scheme of things, the stakes for Anthony's case are not as high as other cases. And because of that, it was very easy to go back to Parma and hang out with Anthony and make jokes with Anthony and talk about the humor in Anthony's story, right? But ultimately in the film, like, I found myself pursuing the second story, the story of Omar Arrington Bay, killed by the police in jail. And it's the highest stake story you could ever imagine. And Omar doesn't look like me, and Omar doesn't necessarily sound like me. And there are differences between Omar and I in a lot of ways. And there are differences between his family's experience of losing a child. Like, I can't empathize with that, or I can't put myself in those shoes because I've never been there. And that's a real leap that I had to make in the film. And one of my guides in making that leap was a law professor named Aisha Bell Hardaway. And she's a law professor at Case Western Reserve University. And she's the person that ultimately introduced me to Omar's family and was almost my spirit guide in trying to like pull this thing off, to try to fuse one silly story and one very serious story together. And there's a kind of emotional moment in the film where I say to Aisha, in some ways I'm struggling, right? Anthony's story, it's easy to tell at a bar. You can get a laugh, you can get a reaction from people. And Omar's story is not. Omar's story is very serious. It's very hard. It's very challenging. And Aisha, without missing a beat, goes, "That's right. It is. And there's nothing wrong with feeling uncomfortable." I think the exact thing she says is, who are we to not be uncomfortable and sad about something like Omar? Because that's what happens when people die at the hands of police. And I think what Aisha is trying to tell me in that moment, and something that I think I live with, is there's something really important about discomfort, that it's not always going to be easy when you're trying to tackle really big and challenging topics about holding the government accountable and what it feels like to lose a loved one. And sitting in that discomfort is really important. And I think people say that, like, people sort of casually say, like, you should be uncomfortable, go do an ice bath, or you should be uncomfortable, run half a mile more than you think that you can. But I'm really experiencing that as I take this movie around the country, that I have to sit there with an audience that's dealing with these things and might have questions for me about, why were you right to tell this story? Why did you feel like you could go there about a guy that was killed by police? Why do you feel like you had the agency and authority to tell these sorts of stories? And there's validity to all those different arguments, but sitting in that discomfort is kind of important, and trying to sit in that discomfort in all aspects of your life when it comes to speaking up on behalf of people that are more marginalized than you, or speaking out when you feel like the government is cracking down in ways that doesn't align with the fabric of this country. Like, discomfort is really important. And I feel like that was kind of the biggest learning for me while making this movie.
Well, thank you so much for giving some of your time before your big RiverRun debut. I know it's not the premiere for the film, but Is this your first
This
time
is the
in
this
North
is the
Carolina?
East Carolina premiere of Crime and
Okay.
Parody, which is very exciting. It's going to
Nice.
screen today, but a few days before this episode comes out, presumably. But the film will be showing again on Friday, April 24th, I believe 5 p.m. or 5:30 p.m. Check the RiverRun website. There's still tickets available for that screening. And the good news is that our North Carolina premiere is sold out, and so you couldn't get tickets anyway, even if this podcast did come out before it. So no loss for
Yeah,
anyone there.
I noticed that. Yeah, so 5 p.m. at Marketplace Theater, number 1. So yeah, April 24th. See y'all, and this will be coming out on Monday. So some people will get to hear that beforehand. So that's great. So go
Excellent.
check out Crime and Parody. And we have one final question that we've been posing to all of our guests this year, and that is, what is in your nerd hat? Is there a movie, a film, a TV show, could even be a documentary that just something beyond your own work that you're just really nerding out about right now?
Yeah, I would say mine is this is a long-term nerd hat, in the sense that I wouldn't say it was in my podcast feed last week, but for the past 10 years of my life, I think one of my favorite bits of media is a podcast called Heavyweight. It's hosted by a man named Jonathan Goldstein, who comes out of to use a sports term, the coaching tree of Ira Glass and This American Life. Jonathan Goldstein worked on that show for several years before going off to do his own thing. And Heavyweight is just amazing. It's really tough to describe, like most good art, about like what the hell it is, but essentially Jonathan Goldstein helps normal people go back and reinvestigate moments of their life that like never really made sense, or they never really had resolution, or they never quite figured out what happened or what went wrong. And in the process of doing that, really new, interesting life lessons get learned. Like one of the best episodes early on is about a guy who was, before he got famous, he was close friends with Moby. And he gave Moby the original like Southern gospel recordings that Moby would go on to sample and make some of the most famous electronic music that has ever been made. And this guy that gave him the records didn't get famous, and is like still in Brooklyn making, I think, Clorox commercials. And Moby's out in California, a millionaire flying around all over the world to play his music. And so Jonathan, almost as I think the word he uses, as an interlocutor, helps people go back and reinvestigate these moments from their past to try to get them some resolution or some closure about a big event in their life. And it's just such a surprising, amazing, emotional podcast. So if you haven't heard it already, go check out Heavyweight, hosted by Jonathan Goldstein.
Awesome. Well, I'll put that on my list of podcasts to check out. Well, thank you so much again for coming on. Do you have any social media, website plugs you'd like to give before you leave?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find out there on the internet. So my personal Instagram and Twitter and Facebook handle is @WillThwaites, just my name, WillThwaites. That's @WillThwaites. And then the movie is really easy too. It's basically @Crime and Parody anywhere you want to look for it. So yeah, follow the film, follow me, and hopefully Crime and Parody will be coming to many more cities and states very soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
The Nerd Hat podcast was produced in partnership with Nerd Hat Productions, which is owned by me, Richard Best. So it's produced by me. Wait, what is this music? Hold on just a second. Let me see if I can find my normal music. There we go. Okay, so the Nerd Hat podcast is produced by Nerd Hat Productions. I want to give a big thank you to my co-hosts, Will Boyer and Laura Morales. They have been such a big part of the success of this podcast. It would not be possible without them. I mean that sincerely. I would have quit a long damn time ago. Thanks also to all of our many collaborators and guests over the years, and most recently Elijah Miller for giving us a new logo. While I was involved in creating it, I did not do the artwork. He did it, and it was amazing. So, the Nerd Hat podcast was recorded by me, Richard Best, and edited by me, Richard Best, with a little bit of assistance from Riverside.fm. I appreciate that program. It has been very helpful for virtual recordings, like on snow days, things like that. You name it. Anyway, I digress. until next time, nerds, nerd hatters, nerdettes, assorted nerd persons, live long and prosper.